Well, thanks for coming, everyone. Very pleased to introduce Óscar Horta, a very good philosopher from Santiago de Compostela, very influential in animal ethics, particularly wild animal ethics and speciesism and concept of moral status. Today, he's going to be presenting for us on oversimplification in population axiology, how highly idealized models risk bad outcomes for humans and non-human animals. Yeah, without further ado, Óscar, if you want to come on up.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much. Thanks everyone here and online. So yeah, first I want to say that I'm going to betray a bit the title, but not the spirit of the title. So many of the things I'm going to say are going to be relevant for population ethics, not just axiology. And then, you know, I thought that rather than speaking about how highly idealized models are risky, I mean, I will say something about that, but I will mostly address what solutions there may be to this. And this is very exploratory. This is very new. So, you know, when I finish, I'll ask you that, yeah, maybe you can do a better job than I am doing. So maybe you can work on this instead of me. I'm happy to hand it over to all of you, really. But I saw a need to do this work. And the problem here we face is that, like, for instance, in other fields, I don't know, in political philosophy, we are all familiar with ideal and non-ideal theory, because, you know, each of them is useful for something. However, that doesn't happen in population ethics. We just have ideal theory. An ideal theory, for sure, can be very useful, right? But the problem is that if it's ideal theory, then the models it will use in population axiology are going to be very simple, and that's going to be useful for things like clarifying what different principles may imply, whether they are sound or not, but they're not going to be useful for actual decision making, right? They're going to be, you know, they're not going to be good tools for us to inform our policies when they may affect what population there may be. And we need something of the kind. Not only that, the problem is that in the meantime, we may be actually informing our policies on the basis of these idealized models. And I'm not just considering something here that might happen. It is happening. I mean, because I've seen it done. I've seen arguments supporting, you know, things like increases in population being strengthened by appeals to the repugnant conclusion, for instance. So something goes on here that needs to be fixed. And the argument I'm going to follow, what I'm going to do in this presentation is, well, I'm going to look at how this could be addressed with regards to three different dimensions in which population axiology and then population ethics are oversimplified. One is with regards to inequality patterns, then with regards to uncertainty, especially optional uncertainty, but also state uncertainty. And then with regards to components of well-being. Unfortunately, all this is going to be very sketchy because otherwise I would be speaking here for, you know, 3 hours. Well, after showing this, I will just say a bit about what this presentation was meant to be, or the title suggested, which is how, you know, if we don't do this, we risk those very bad scenarios for humans and mostly for non-human animals. So in order to address this, I'm going to start with, you know, the all good repugnant conclusion. No, I'm not sure if good, but yeah, maybe not that old anyway, but we are all very familiar with it. And we know that we can reach this conclusion in several ways. I mean, one of them is by accepting totalism, because the area in C is larger than the area in A. And we can also reach it if, well, we consider what the mere addition paradox implies. So I'm not gonna explain here the mere addition paradox. I'm gonna just assume that you are all familiar with it. I'm not gonna say a lot more about the repugnant conclusion. What I'm gonna say just is that I'm gonna be exploring here how we can deal with this conclusion when we consider non-ideal views, when we consider non-idealized models. So the first one, inequality. So that would be how we would represent a certain population in our standard models. But of course, we know that populations are never like that. Populations are gonna always be unequal when it comes to their distribution patterns. So of course, we can consider that if we say that a certain population has this level, what we are really meaning is that that's the average net level of well-being. And of course, the distribution can be very different. I mean, we can say, well, maybe the distribution can be linear, but that would be unrealistic. It may have, you know, the shape determined by, say, a Laplace distribution or a Pareto one. Yeah, maybe these two others may be a bit more realistic. So if we accept this, then how can we understand the shape that C would have? How would C look like? So it could look like something like this, right? If we accept a normal distribution, or something like this, if we accept a Pareto one. Now, the interesting thing is that when we look at these shapes that C would have, which obviously look much more realistic, then the repugnance in it becomes much more significant. I mean, this is clearly much more acceptable than C in the standard population model. I mean, I could find somehow distasteful the idea that C is so great, but if C is just a population of many individuals having some pleasure in the life, and that's it, just a small pleasure, then I can think, well, yeah, not great, but maybe not that bad. But when I consider the other two populations down there, well, those really look bad, right? And especially consider that the last one there, in it, the majority of the individuals have lives that are net negative. And this would be, you know, a model that would match how other things, like for instance, wealth is distributed. Well, well-being is not wealth, but maybe, you know, a realistic pattern should have that shape. Not only that, well, if we then consider not just C, but C in comparison to A, then the repugnant conclusion becomes much more repugnant, of course. So we can formulate this other version of the conclusion, this inequality sensitive version. And again, we can consider it if we consider other distribution pattern. Now, there may be other counterintuitive implications here. So for instance, look at what happens when we compare C with minus C. So minus C is a horrendous situation according to a standard population axiology, right? It's basically mirroring C. So all the good things that C has, well, in minus C, there are horrible things. Well, you know, even in the standard model, they don't look so different. But then when we compare them like this, I mean, the difference between both of them, you know, look even less significant. So the idea that one of those populations is really excellent and the other one is really horrible is hard to grasp, right? So is there a way in which we can block the repugnant conclusion? Well, not really in the ideal model if we accept, you know, all the, you know, standard principles that people would apply here. But what I'm saying here has nothing to do with ideal population ethics. I'm not, you know, saying that what I'm presenting here is going to help us to solve the merit-addition paradox in its standard formulation. I'm not claiming anything like that, you know. What I'm claiming is that when we approach these problems in a non-ideal way, then we may have ways to block this conclusion, at least as implied by the merit-addition paradox. I mean, I'm perfectly aware that someone who accepts, I don't know, some form of utilitarian totalism won't really be much impressed by this. But some people don't, and yet find themselves struggling with the merit-addition paradox. So what happens here is that at some point, we may think, well, you know, we can start with A, and there is inequality in A, but still everyone is sort of relatively fine. But then we go from A to B, C, D, and so on. And the level of well-being of those who are worse off becomes lower and lower until at some point, there are going to be individuals who are going to have, net levels of well-being. And there seems to be something especially bad about that, right? Not only that, some people would claim that there is also something bad in a situation in which there are individuals at a zero level, not even with net negative levels. And mind that then the population at which we are, for sure is not C, but it's not, X, Y, or whatever. I mean, we are already quite far from C. So we can say, okay, when we reach this point, the mere addition paradox can continue to work, because maybe L is unacceptable, or maybe L would be the last acceptable position, but then L plus would not. So we can conclude this in different ways. So some people may accept it because they accept some kind of deontological views, and you may say here, wait, but stop, Oscar, you were speaking about axiology or ethics. Yeah, but some people have these views that, like for instance, these Scanlon views that the good depends on the right instead of being the other way around, as consequentialists would have it. Then, according to some views that focus on the worse off, there will be something especially bad about this inequality-sensitive conclusion. But even if we reject these views, even if we are not egalitarians, for instance, we may find it something very hard to accept that, it's okay to add individuals below the zero level. Okay. So next problem, what happens when we consider uncertainty? Well, in ideal theory, again, we can have a model like that. In non-ideal theory, what would happen is something different, which is that sort of probability weighted average, in fact, would probably be the average point between some sort of probability range, according to which we would say, well, we are expecting that the net level of this population will fall there, because we never know for sure that the net level of well-being is going to be there. So ex ante, there's going to be always uncertainty when it comes to, considering what level of well-being a population will have when we create that population, or when we make it possible that that population exists, right? So this is counterfactual, but in fact, even more worrying, this can also happen ex post. So it may be that there is actually an already existing population, and we may not know exactly what the well-being in that population is. Consider, for instance, effort to assess, to measure the well-being in different societies today. They have a very hard time. I mean, they propose some objective criteria, and then they do things like, polls asking people how they value their own welfare. But, we are very uncertain about the results. I mean, the French are more pessimistic about their welfare than, say, people from, say, the United States, maybe due to cultural reasons. So this is especially problematic, because if we just had option uncertainty here, then we could say, well, but you know what? Maybe we can solve this, or we can improve our knowledge here by running some pilot programs, maybe in some countries, or maybe in certain areas in those countries, and then see how it went. And then we could extrapolate the knowledge there to other places. But because we also have state uncertainty, it's not clear how that would help, right? So what happens? Well, as you can see, I think that that you can understand what I'm reflecting there in those graphs. That the level could be somewhere in that range. So what happens then is that when we consider C in the standard way, idealized way, and then C when we consider uncertainty, we are faced with this very unpleasant view of what C really stands for. Because there, what happens with C is that C is that prospect, and we are running out here of these models when we are just considering, you know, the axiological evaluation of outcomes. We are considering actually prospects here. So in C, we have these prospects where, you know, it's just slightly more likely that the resulting outcome will be positive, you know, and it could be even better, but it could also be at 0 or below 0, or, you know, not just barely below 0, but somehow below 0. So again, this sounds really repugnant. So it seems that this conclusion really is much more repugnant than the standard one. And again, a similar counterintuitive implication, similar to the one we saw before, happens here, because when we consider C and minus C, well, it seems that they are not really that different. In fact, it may well be that we choose to produce C, and we end up, you know, the resulting outcome ends up being significantly worse, if luck so decides it, than the outcome that would result if we chose minus C instead. And is there a way to block then this repugnant conclusion, like it's we saw in the case of sorry, it says inequality sensitive, it should say uncertainty sensitive there. Well, maybe there is, because maybe we can accept that B is better than A, then C is better than B, and so on. But at some point, when a prospect contains the, you know, according to certain prospects, we may end up in a certain outcome that is net negative, we may think, okay, that's something very bad. That really is a prospect we should not choose. And again, the same thing that we happened before, maybe the limit could be at the point at which the worst possible outcome is at the 0 level. Maybe L here would be the last scenario we could accept, because L plus would be already unacceptable. So we could reach this conclusion if we accept certain deontological views, if we accept that adding individuals below the 0 level is especially bad, or just if we consider that, yeah, we have reasons to prevent scenarios at which the population ends up with a level of well-being below 0. So this view would be very similar to the previous one, but there are some minor differences, but yeah, we don't need to get into that. And finally, the last way in which we could de-idealize standard population ethics could be by considering components of well-being. So according to this, we could consider not just net levels of well-being, but how positive and negative well-being end up when we aggregate them, well, implying that the net level of well-being is a certain particular one. So if we consider A there, the thing here is that there are different possible populations that can end up being evaluated by, you know, standard population axiology as having the same net level of well-being. And for sure, again, we may hold a view according to which this is perfectly right. You know, we may think that those 3 scenarios that we can see in the right are all equally valuable, that the well-being that there is in them is just the same in the 3 of them. But some or many may feel a bit uncomfortable about this, may think, well, there is something especially bad when suffering, you know, becomes too bad. Some people may hold asymmetric views according to which, in order to evaluate how good or bad a certain scenario is for the population in it, we don't just need to assess the net level of well-being. We also need to assess something like the total suffering that is present in that. I mean, some people may respond to this saying, well, that can be. Maybe what's going on here is that we are not aggregating positive welfare and negative welfare properly. Yeah, that's another explanation of it. Sure. So if that happens, then what we'll see is that there is a conflict between different people concerning how they aggregate positive and negative welfare. But then if that's so, then it seems that we still need something of the kind. We still need a more nuanced axiology here that can account for those conflicts and can be useful for us to see where is it that we reach different conclusions concerning how good or bad a certain population is. Those holding asymmetric views may be moved by an argument like the following. No? So for instance, suppose that next week, one day of the week, you are going to be suffering some horrible, torture that will lead us to endure the most extreme suffering that is possible for you to suffer, the most extreme one, for say 12 hours, right? Let's give it some time. And then some other day, doesn't matter whether it's previous day or the day after, we don't know, you are gonna experience for the same amount of time, the mildest possible pleasure. Maybe, I don't know, some smell you like, but it's not very intense. It's not like, oh, how nice this smell is, it's fantastic. No, it's just, this smells kind of nice, right? And suppose you have the opportunity of changing only one of those. So you have the opportunity of getting rid of the torture. Instead, for the same amount of time, those 12 hours, you'll be experiencing the mildest possible suffering that you are able to experience. I don't know, maybe some tiny scratch that you barely feel, right? Or alternatively, you can shift the pleasure and you can move from the mildest possible pleasure to the most ecstatic, wonderful pleasure that you can experience. Now, I've asked this to many different audiences, and everyone prefers to shift the torture. No one wants to, okay, yeah, I'll change the pleasure. So if that's so, then there seems that some kind of asymmetry is going on here. Now, this, of course, has an answer to this. You can reply to this. You can say, well, maybe that's because we are unable to imagine how it would be to experience this wonderful pleasure. But then, the response goes, but how come you are able to imagine the horrible suffering? The fact that you are perfectly able to imagine one and not the other, maybe that's giving us some hints here. And with regards to this, there is some possible reply. You may say, well, what happens is that it seems that maybe animals like us are able to suffer more extreme suffering than extreme pleasure. That maybe, if we depart from the zero level, if we are going to value a certain experience that lasts for 12 hours, maybe the negative one would have, I don't know, we would cardinally, we could measure it and say, yeah, it's level minus 100, but the most wonderful one would be only, 40 or maybe 30 or whatever, right? Yeah, maybe that's so. Maybe that's so. But then if I can change the torture for 12 hours, right? And I can either do this or, instead of experiencing the pleasure for 12 hours, experience the most wonderful pleasure for 100 hours, I still chose removing the torture. For 200 hours, I still prefer not to experience the terrible torture, And some other people may have different intuitions, and they may say, yeah, 200 hours, I'll go for that. But, it seems that there is some problem there with the aggregation. And not only that, let's set aside the 200 hours. Let's stick with the 12 hours. suppose they tell you, imagine that you were able to experience a pleasure that is as intense as the torture is. You know, it's just mirroring. Would you go for the pleasure? I mean, or would you just be neutral? It seems like you should be neutral between shifting from the torture or shifting from the mild pleasure. And I was still, I mean, maybe there is some problem in that I can't imagine it. But even if I try to think, what would that wonderful pleasure look like? I will still get rid of the torture instead, you know? Just like some people, you know, when they are tortured, they do things like ruining their whole lives and sending their loved ones to death, betraying their most cherished causes and all that, because, you know, they are under terrible torture. But I'm pretty sure that if they were offered, hey, if you confess, if you tell us who your, you know, comrades are, where you are going to be able to experience this wonderful pleasure for 1 year, you know, no one would accept doing that. So, well, you know, you can buy these arguments or you can't, or maybe you don't buy them. But even if you don't buy them, you can see that some people will see an issue here. So there is some room for debate here. And then the thing is that if we accept that components of well-being should be relevant in order to assess how good or bad a population is, then C may look something like this, where the gray area represents the total happiness that there is, the light gray, the dark gray represent the total suffering, or if you prefer, if you are, I don't know, maybe you hold an objective list account of well-being, the bad things. And then that white stripe there represent the, you know, the net level there. Actually, the line over the white area. So again, C in this way looks worse than in the other way, you know. And again, this suffering-sensitive repugnant conclusion looks worse than the standard one. And again, we have the same problem when we compare C and minus C. So consider what happens there. So actually here, if you hold an asymmetric view, you are more in, you're in deepest trouble than in the previous cases. Because here, what happens is that if you give, if you are going to value not just the net level of well-being, but also the amount of suffering that there is there, you may reach the conclusion that C is worse than minus C, because C contains much more suffering, right? Or, you know, you may be at a loss, you know, because you have both criteria, you know, net level, the suffering that there is. How can we compare this? But, you know, it should be clear that minus C is worse. How can we block this? Well, there are different ways to do it, but maybe some people would claim that when we reach, for instance, a situation like this, things start to become awful because the suffering there becomes too much for it to make it acceptable to aggregate, to add there a new population with so much suffering, with more suffering even than here. So again, we can accept this. If, for instance, we consider that, you know, the total amount of suffering that there is can't go beyond a certain limit, or maybe the proportion of suffering with regards to positive welfare, or maybe something else, like some function of the suffering and the time, or, you know, maybe the total amount of significant suffering. I mean, some people holding suffering-focused views would say, well, if it's minor suffering, if it's mild suffering, it's acceptable. I mean, we don't consider that, but we have an issue with extreme suffering, or maybe some combination of all these criteria. Okay, so why is all this important? That was my positive case for, you know, considering all these alternative criteria. Then why doing this can be relevant? Well, I mentioned before also that there were some risks with oversimplified axiologies. And now we are in a better position to know why, because, well, they can help to promote, considering they can lead us to promote populations where many, maybe a majority, are, having net levels of well-being that are negative because of unequal distributions of welfare, because we overlook this, then we will be in a serious risk of facilitating, very bad scenarios where maybe everyone is below the zero level. And then we can create vast amounts of suffering that will be totally avoidable because we are actually creating them in the thought that we are really improving that situation there. And why is that bad? Well, it's bad for humans. I mean, because all I've said applies when it comes to creating new human populations, And I mentioned before that this can happen, because among other things, it's not that we have optional uncertainty we're working there. We also have state uncertainty. We don't know how good actual existing populations are, really. But then in the case of non-human animals, this could be even worse because, people, due to several reasons, including the fact that they don't give them a lot of consideration because they are speciesists, and people have an interest in using animals, well, they are likely to accept a situation where they would be more thoughtful in the case of human beings. But then there are other biases involved here, like not just mere species, but also, well, we have biases and cognitive dissonance here going on. We may also have, for instance, a bias against small animals, well, the vast majority of them. I mean, even people who, are involved like in, in animal scholarship or animal advocacy, typically disregard invertebrates. Then there is, of course, the risk, and this is the key idea here, I think, that our welfare assessments may be even slightly wrong, slightly inaccurate. And if that means that, in fact, their welfare, we estimate it to be here, but in fact it's just slightly below, that can make a huge difference because, of that small difference that there is between C and minus C, And finally, because of the vast numbers of animals at stake, this can be very relevant, right? So, for instance, in practice, I've heard often this argument, it was labeled as the logic of the larder in the 19th century by Henry Salt, that if animals have good lives, when we breed them to eat them or to use them in other ways, then eating them or using them in those other ways is good because then we are bringing them into existence. And even if we kill them afterwards, their lives were fine. So there are reasons to, consider this argument problematic. Among other ones, most people don't accept it with humans, meaning that, then if that's so, why are we accepting the argument in the case of non-human animals? I mean, for sure, some consequentialist philosophers are happy to accept the argument, both in the case of non-human animals and in the case of humans. But strangely enough, I just hear this argument when it comes to non-human animals. I almost never hear the argument presented by those same philosophers when it comes to human beings. But anyway, the thing is, many people may buy the argument in the case of non-human animals for the reasons mentioned before. I mean, we eat the animals, so we are eager to find justifications for that. So if animal welfare assessments tell us, okay, no, the welfare of these animals is fine, then we are happy to say, okay, then we have reasons to promote this to go on. And the same can happen in the case of wild animals, animals living out there in natural ecosystems who suffer due to a number of factors, natural factors like, weather conditions, lack of food, water, disease, conflicts, parasitisms, accidents, and so on. So it is very counterintuitive to many people, the idea that these animals are having harsh time and we should help them. Though an increasing number of people really are in support of those views. But then if, some welfare assessment lead us to think, well, maybe the welfare is positive, then we may think, okay, yeah, well, there is nothing really to worry here or little to worry here. Well, I don't think the argument would work, because even if the level of well-being of a certain animal is net positive, you know, if you can still improve it by removing factors that cause them to suffer here and there, why shouldn't we do it? But anyway, you get the whole idea, which is that nevertheless, there may be a significant problem here in that their net level of well-being can be worse than we thought, right? And just let me clarify that I mentioned just, you know, empirical uncertainty, just either counterfactual or factual. Things may become more complex if we consider modal uncertainty here, if we consider other, you know, uncertainty about which scenarios are possible, not just about, you know, which one of them may occur and so on. But I don't have the time here to address that. So that would be it. That's what I wanted to speak about today. I just want to close by saying that, as I said, this is all very sketchy, and for sure, I mean, I'm sure that I made lots of mistakes in my assessment of the problem, but I think that nevertheless, dealing with this really is very important. I mean, I would be, you know, I wouldn't be that worried if, you know, no ideal population ethics didn't exist yet, but population ethics were used only, as I said before, to assess how intuitive certain principles are. But this is not the case. That idealized population ethics models are actually used to inform actual decisions. So this means that this really is problematic, and we really need to assess it. And, you know, due to my mistakes, there may be other people in this room smarter than me, or maybe at the Zoom call, yeah, clever people, better philosophers than I am that can do this better. That would be great. I mean, let's do it. I mean, you can grab all these ideas and use them yourself. I mean, I'm happy with that. I mean, it's not that I want to write some papers. I just want this work to be done, because otherwise the, you know, the consequences may be quite bad. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to all your criticism and questions and comments and so on.
Let's open for questions, both online and, yeah, and in the room. No. Okay. Okay, and if you're online and you have a question, please just raise your hand. Yes, Johnny.
Thanks, Óscar. That was really interesting. So in these non-ideal circumstances, we have epistemic obstacles, processing, well-being, is your suggestion then that we should be taking a more precautionary approach? Well, I wasn't quite sure what's your recommendation in view of this, in view of these non-ideal circumstances?
Right. So we don't necessarily need to accept that principle. We could, but we don't necessarily need to accept it. If we have, if we accept like some principle, like the one that I mentioned there, even if we were Bayesians and not accept that principle, we would still have issues with that going on. But yes, if we accept that principle, then we will have serious issues with regards to the second problem. But with regards to the first problem and the third problem, with inequality and with suffering, you know, it's a different issue there. So we don't need to get into that. Yeah, thanks.
Josh. Thank you for a really terrific talk. I really love all of these ideas. There's one aspect of your model that still seems to be quite idealized to me, and so I'm curious about how you think about this kind of zero level, which I think in a kind of formal or abstract sense, it really makes sense to have this threshold between net good and net bad. But in real life, the difference between the positive 0.1 and a negative 0.1 is not going to be felt or observable. And it's all a continuum, it's all a gradation. And so you're still, I think, really kind of idealizing this threshold of zero as being a really important point. And I wonder whether your ideas or argument might change by taking a more kind of continuous approach to welfare and seeing it as existing along a spectrum where there's not going to be that bright line between net good and net bad in reality.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that question. So, you know, when you said, yeah, your model is still idealing, I mean, I was thinking of all the ways in which, you know, this could get much more complex. But yeah, I wasn't expecting that one. But yeah, like for instance, consider, as I mentioned, the issue when you have a view that is sensitive to, you know, the components of well-being. And I've made this with just positive and negative well-being, but there may be other components. Even if you just consider positive and negative well-being, I suppose that you're a hedonist. What if you don't consider like extreme suffering, like mild suffering, you know? What if you consider things like time? So you may think, okay, if this amount of suffering happens during a short amount of time, it's much worse than if it happens intermittently, for instance, or during a larger amount of time. So yeah, I can see those issues, and that can affect how you estimate the zero level, right? Having said this, and of course, yeah, and a further consideration is that you may make sense of something like the net level of well-being and still claim that that's not the final value that there is there. And this may be shocking to some people, but for instance, if you consider what prioritarianism, you know, would tell us, something similar happens there, right? So perhaps the zero level really, would tell us only a part of the story. On the other hand, someone would claim maybe what you are claiming is something different. Maybe there needs to be some zero level at some point. So what happens is that what you are really doing is somehow considering something like suffering in two different ways. One, when you consider it in itself, and then when you consider it in comparison to positive welfare, and then you somehow combine the relevance of those two different things, and then you reach a final conclusion. And then there is when we would draw a scale and we would have this other zero level there, right? But it seems that what you are doing is arguing that, no, we should go further than that. The zero level doesn't make sense to me. I can understand the reason why you say that, though I think I wouldn't go that far. I think that, yeah, at some point, we need to find, you know, like for instance, imagine that my life becomes, so suppose that I have an expectation of how my life will go. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And then that expectation, I need to revise it on light of new evidence, and it's worse. And I say, yeah, okay. And it goes down and down and down. And at some point, I'm totally sure that I want to kill myself, right? At some point, there needs to be a limit at which I think, okay, here, I should kill myself. And it may be that I am epistemically flawed in order to discover where there is, right? So I may think, I'm not sure if I should kill myself here or not, now or not. But if I'm saying this, I may be implying somehow that if I had all the information and if I could think, you know, rationally in the, you know, without any bias, I would know that it's here where you know, my life it's not gonna work any longer. So that would be the zero level. So I still think that the zero level, even if difficult to locate, and even if a bit abstract, makes sense. But yes, I mean, this disagreement would also be another area where work could be useful.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't think it necessarily changes too much of what you're saying, but yeah, I think that distinction between the like worth living and not worth living is just practically less clear than these models seem to suggest. But yeah, that is just kind of a I won't believe it anymore. So, thank you.
Yeah, but if you are considering killing yourself, well, I hope you are not. But if someone is considering killing herself or himself or whatever, I mean, that difference should be relevant for them.
Yeah, but I just don't think that the individuals in -C are at that point, like that. Just being barely under zero doesn't seem to be a suicidal case necessarily, or if you want to make it that those people would be considering ending their life, then I think the people at Z positive or the typical Z, those people are not well off then if there's such a slight difference in well-being. It's it's hard to imagine exactly what it would look like in reality comparing people from those two populations.
Okay.
Next is Tom.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I think I'm convinced by everything you said, but I'm trying to think of how someone who's sort of a defender of ideal population ethics would respond. And this is what I came up with what they might say. So I thought they might say something like, it's just sort of too early in the development of the discipline of population ethics to start moving to non-ideal theory, because they have no idea how to answer the big questions about what the basic principles are in this field. So we don't even know yet whether we should be counting the creation of new good lives as existential benefits as something that we have reason to do or not. If we should have, except that we have reason to create these lives, we don't know whether we should be doing like some kind of total utilitarianism or something more like average utilitarianism. So we said all these big questions, and how we resolve those questions is going to make a massive difference to what policies we should be adopting when it comes to population size and animal treatment of animals and so on. So yeah, the urgent thing to do is to try and solve those problems as fast as possible, and kind of that's the thing that's going to make the biggest difference in the long run, and just sort of starting to work on these kind of non-ideal questions is this kind of not that important compared to solving working out what the basic principles are in the first place. So to give a specific example on the Republican conclusion case, maybe you showed that in the real world, the ways in which a repugnant conclusion might arise might be even slightly more repugnant than in the idealized cases. But the big question is how we should respond to the repugnant conclusion. Should we bite the bullet on it, or should we reject total utilitarianism? That's the kind of, I'm just wondering, so I'm curious how you would kind of respond to that kind of.
Yeah, so I think I would say maybe 4 things. So the first one is that, no, that's not the big question. The big question is what we do in practice. And solving the repugnant conclusion can be of some use, but it's not the main, issue at stake to guiding, the way in which we want, for guiding the way in which we want the world to be. Non-ideal theory will be what will help us there. Ideal theory won't. Ideal theory will help us, but eventually it's going to be non-ideal theory that really makes a difference. Like, for instance, suppose that we are debating about, I don't know, abortion or euthanasia, or I don't know, the ethics of war, any practical problem, eating animals, whatever you think of. We have this field of work that is practical ethics, and that's what allows us to assess those problems. normative ethics alone can't. Why is that? Because, you know, there is also empirical issues there that are necessary in order to deal with those issues, because there are many peculiarities involving each case. There may be also metaphysical problems at stake. There are a bunch of other things. So it is practical ethics that really makes the difference there. And here it's just the same. So, you know, ideal theory help us, but barely. It is non-ideal theory that matters here. So that would be the first thing. I mean, and the second thing would be that we can't wait for it. Suppose that what I said what I just said was totally wrong. I mean, we can't wait for this to happen. I mean, because otherwise we may not able to do it ever, because maybe we won't solve those problems, right? Then third thing is when you consider how, I don't know, political philosophers, for instance, do, or for instance, ethicists, when you consider non-ideal and ideal political philosophy and normative, like more principle focus or practical ethics too, I mean, they do fine. I mean, we have both fields in each area, and yeah, that doesn't look as problematic. And then finally, the final thing that I would say is something that I already pointed out, that I have seen already how these principles, these idealized principles in you know, population ethics are being used in order to defend some policies over others. So yeah, that's why I think that this really is needed.
Next is Dominic online. Should we like to talk, Dominic?
Can you hear me?
Barely.
Barely. Let me see if I can.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks very much. What a great talk. I was interested in thinking about how some of the things that you pointed out were relevant in a very different context. So outside the context of population axiology, there's some very similar issues that apply to individual cases where, and I'm particularly interested in thinking about humans, but it applies to non-human animals too, where individuals are predicted to have lives of positive well-being, but only just positive well-being. Now, a number of so for example, somebody who's going to be in a minimally conscious state, and there's a prediction that it would be in their best interests to be alive. But if we make such a prediction, then if we acknowledge some of the factors that you point out, that could still be compatible with some periods of positive well-being and also significant periods of suffering. There may be significant uncertainty about the nature of the experience of the individual. So it may be net positive, it may be neutral, or it may be net negative. And of course, there are different components of well-being. So there's positive components of well-being and also negative components of well-being. And depending on how we weigh up, we think about uncertainty, the components of well-being, or the possibility of periods of significant suffering, then we may reach different conclusions than a view that somebody is going to exist in a state of marginally positive well-being in the future. So that was the main point to say. I think that there's some interesting parallels with how we think about some of these cases, and for similar reasons, people may come to different conclusions. But of course, the interesting response to that you might have thought about, the difference, and I think this helps with your main argument, is that when it's within an individual, there's a plausible claim that goods can compensate for bads. So you might think, or some people would claim, that it makes sense to aggregate well-being for an individual in a way that doesn't make as much sense when you've got people who've got net negative well-being, to say they can't be compensated for by the fact that there are some people with good lives. So in your repugnant conclusion, where you've got some people with positive well-being and a large number of people with very negative well-being, the the non-aggregationists and the non-consequentialists would say, look, that doesn't lead to us thinking that that's okay if it overall averages out.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. I think that would be so, though, with regards to components of well-being, and also with regards to uncertainty, not with regards to inequality, of course. That would apply only when you consider populations. So yeah, nothing else to add.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I don't work in this field, so I apologize for my question is a bit naive maybe. So it's not entirely clear to me how your discussion about equality, or you're including inequalities in your talk makes your approach less ideal or non-ideal, because I would think inequality itself is something is subject to an ideal theory treatment and a non-ideal theory treatment. So, for example, I would think that from an ideal theory perspective, inequality must be identifiable, first of all, quantifiable, not subject to changes based on unpredictable human behavior. So, to me, these are kind of elements that make the treatment of inequality ideal. And I'm wondering how your treatment of inequality here is non-ideal in this respect. But I'm not sure this question makes sense.
No, sure it does. So yeah, I mean, and that's in a previous questions I mentioned, I was expecting. I mean, there are several ways in which what I point out as ways in which the theory can be non-ideal are still highly idealized. But even so, they already point at differences that are very significant with respect to the standard model. So yes, I mean, inequality can be a much more complex phenomenon. And not only that, we should consider what happens when we combine the three problems that I mentioned: inequality with uncertainty, inequality with suffering, and so on. So yeah, I completely agree that this would still need to be developed further. Yeah, no question about that.
Step in then. So I think I was on board with the first half. I can see how model can go wrong and there's bad results in situations of uncertainty and accounting for the different moments of good and bad welfare and so on. You mentioned that this could have actual bad consequences for humans and animals, and you briefly mentioned things like logic of the larder, but I didn't totally understand in which situations these highly idealized models are actually used to make decisions, and also then I don't understand how it can lead to bad results. I mean, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the situations in which these models are used and how you see the idealized nature of the models causing problems.
Well, for instance, right now we could claim that there are reasons why human population should, be increased or decreased, right? If there are more humans around, there will be more, knowledge gained by humans as a whole. And, that would also stimulate technological advancement, economic progress, etc., etc. So some people claim this would be very positive. On the other hand, some people may claim, that would exacerbate climate change, that would increase even more animal exploitation. Then, because resources are limited, then it may be that will when we increase the population, the increase will be more significant among those who are faring worse and so on. So there are different considerations here. So when you include the fact that, and the repugnant conclusion tells us that we should favor a larger population. If if the repugnant conclusion is wrong, then we are making a mistake there. And if suppose that when we are weighing the considerations, we are undecided, and then the repugnant conclusion is the tiebreaker, and maybe that's something that is going to make us make the world a worse place than it would otherwise be. So that would be one example. The example of the logic of the larder would be that, we bring more animals into existence to eat them because we believe that their welfare is positive overall. So yeah, those would be two examples where we could use this. Of course, in the case of the logic of the larder, you could say, well, but you don't need a repugnant conclusion there at all. But then you could have this response by someone who, for instance, supports factory farming, which is, okay, so with these resources, you can breed this number of animals who will be free, and then we will kill them. Or else we can breed many more animals, but because their lives will be net positive, the repugnant conclusion says this is better. Now, of course, you may support veganism and say neither the first nor the second scenario are good. But some other people may think, oh yeah, well, this is right, C is better. So yeah, factory farming, if done according to certain welfare standards and so on, which may be, ridiculous standards maybe, should be acceptable. And they're actually wrong because those animals have net negative lives.
Right. I mean, I understand the taking this as a hypothetical choice faced by someone. Should we increase the human population up to something like a Z population, or should we increase factory farming for the same reason? I understand why the lack of certainty about the outcome, like the state and option uncertainty and the inequality and everything, could cause us to make a serious mistake here. And I understand that the huge numbers involved to multiply that mistake. I'm just wondering, is anyone, or maybe this wasn't the purpose of the talk, but is there anyone who's making such decisions? Like no one has to decide, shall we increase the human population, or shall we, make factory farming much more extensive than it already is? Like, do you see this as something like that, some kind of decision that states are actually making, or I'm wondering where the practical element comes in?
Well, someone may decide to have children by accepting this. And then if many people decide it, then there is an increase in the population. It may be a small increase in comparison to, the numbers that the total human population has, but it's nevertheless a number of individuals who may have an impact, who may be, increasing the demand for animal products, who may be, increasing other negative impact that humans may have in the wild, and in other areas, who may be a lot of different things, who may do many things that may not be net positive. So, or maybe not. Maybe having children is good for reasons different from the repugnant conclusion. That may well be, so let me clarify. I'm not saying that we should have smaller populations here. I'm not rejecting the argument that humans should reproduce as much as they can, and that, those expected models that say, yeah, we'll reach 10 billion, but then go down, we should defeat them and go for 12 or 15. I'm not saying that that's wrong, What I'm saying is that if that is right, then that can't be because we reach the conclusion that that's right based on these idealized, oversimplified models.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have another quick question about, so you identified these three criteria, like inequalities of dimensional well-being or uncertainty, as the kind of thing need to be considered to make your discussion, the treatment of the required conclusion, like the non-ideal theory. So I wonder, so do you think this list of three elements exhausts the range of consideration that make a theory non-ideal? Because I could, I'm interested to hear thing I would think is people preferences and value pluralism is something that might need to be considered, because some people might be happy with inequality, some people are happy with suffering, so some people might be some religious views whereby suffering is necessarily not a bad thing. So these are also things that I would think a non-ideal theory would need to consider. But I wonder what your view is about the list of things that would need to be included.
Yeah, well, I think that these would be the more relevant ones, but of course there are others that may also depend on what we consider valuable, right? And of course, I may think that autonomy, for instance, is totally relevant, but some other people may think that autonomy really is very relevant. And I haven't said almost anything about time, but that may be also another consideration. So when you value or when you estimate how valuable a life is, what are the factors that you include there? I mean, maybe the length of the time is something to be considered. I said something also about the temporal location of value, right? I mean, when you watch a film where, there is this person who lives in a very bad situation for a long time, but then eventually she fights back and she is released, and the rest of her life is very happy, And you consider another case where you have someone who is very, very happy during the beginning of her life, and then something dramatic happens, and the end of their life of her life is very bad. And suppose that in the second case, the length of the time that person spent having a happy time was slightly happier than what happens in the case of the person in the previous case. It seems that it shouldn't be a drama. It should be a very happy film. It should be a happier one. And yet many people are, confused about this. So yeah, there are many different considerations, and I'm sure that I am missing a lot of things that could work here. But my intention really was, in presenting these three ways in which this can happen, was twofold. So, I mean, on the one hand, I wanted to present those examples because I think they are meaningful. On the other hand, the examples are not really that important. So they're important in that they exemplify that there is some challenge there to be met. Thanks.
So yeah, an additional conclusion that I think could be drawn from these really, really interesting ideas is that there's way too much focus on kind of aggregate welfare, or that we're thinking too much about improving overall well-being, either across an individual's life or across a population or across whatever set of things we're thinking about. And really what we ought to be focusing on is reducing variance, either in inequality in how welfare is experienced in a population, or variability in an individual's lifetime, or uncertainty, confidence intervals of how sure we are that someone's going to end up living a life that was overall good. So yeah, do you agree that that's something that this presentation kind of leads us to conclude, that overall welfare is less important than just making sure that there's not inequality overall?
I don't think that the presentation really argues for that. Actually, what the presentation does is, maybe you think that, and if you think that, then you'll have something to say about how we make these decisions. But even if you suppose you don't care about equality, right? I do care about, well, I don't care about equality really, but I do care about inequality. But anyway, suppose that that's not your case. You don't care about inequality, but it's still, because populations in the real world are unequal, that's going to be relevant, because you may care about there being individuals with net levels of well-being. So, inequality is not really the problem there. The problem is that there are those individuals, and because inequality exists, we have this problem. And also let me clarify that. You may think that, for instance, in the case of suffrage, suppose that you don't buy any of the arguments for claiming that components of well-being are relevant. And so you don't buy that with regards to the third problem, making this distinction is going to make a difference. Well, fair enough. But then maybe the other 2 points are going to be relevant for you. Or it can be the other way around. Maybe there is some other one that you don't see as problematic, but you see as problematic others. It may even be that, you don't like nothing in the presentation I've done of how to deal with these ways of making population models in population axiology more realistic, but nevertheless, you may still be persuaded that we should do more work on that, which really is my main motivation here. So, well, sorry, because I used your question. I mean, I tackled your question, but then I said something else. Anyway, whatever.
Thank you.
Thanks.
To me, it seems that the three considerations that you brought forward especially apply to populations that are made up of really complex species like humans or maybe some wild animals. But I see the possibility of smaller populations really approximating the ideal population ethics case, like domesticated animals like dogs. Do you think the fact that humans and maybe wild animals populations are so complex to model gives us reason to focus on more simple populations that are easier that more easily approximate the ideal case?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I mean, the only problem is that the other populations also exist. So, we need to have some sort of guidance to know what we do in their case. But I agree with your main point. I mean that in the case of certain individuals, there may be less differences, and also that the level of uncertainty that we may have, not just state uncertainty, but for instance, option uncertainty, we may be pretty sure that a certain intervention is going to affect a certain population in a certain way, and we may be much more uncertain in some other cases, right? But that doesn't mean that they will always be at the same level. And if you consider, for instance, domesticated animals, for sure, domesticated animals, I mean, have differences in their welfare. So, some, if you have a couple of dogs that are sisters, maybe, one tends to be happier than the other just for genetic reasons. So yeah, it's not going to be like no difference there whatsoever. But I think that your point is valid. But still, as I said, we need to make these decisions for everyone.